All right.
All good.
Okay, perfect. Well, everybody, welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth telling and myth busting. Very happy with the guest that I have today. We are joined by Jay Watts of the Communist Party of Canada. Yes, you heard that, the Communist Party of Canada. And yeah, we're going to be talking, and yeah, so it's going to be another edition of All Things Canada, but we're probably even going to step away from even talking about Canada and probably get into some good conversations about political philosophy and why communism is a better alternative for the system which is crumbling before us, which is capitalism. We're going to be talking about the coronavirus crisis and lots of things. So first of all, Jay, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk to you.
It's an honor to have you. And Jay, what's your position in the Canadian Communist Party?
So I'm the central organizer. So my responsibility is sort of dealing with the other national and provincial committees and club life and stuff, helping out in the office. We're running a recruitment campaign starting soon. To our 100th anniversary is coming up. So we're trying to grow in anticipation of that and do some education for our members. As well, I'm working on our fall political campaign, which is related to the capitalist response to their own crisis right now. So the Liberals, supported by the NDP here, which is the Liberal government, people probably know Justin Trudeau.
Unfortunately,
Yeah, it's putting through a whole series of changes that are meant to deal with the crisis that we're in. That we think they're giving a progressive patina to it. We don't think it's actually progressive. So our campaign is related to critiquing that and advancing our own demands with them. Yeah. So
perfect.
busy things.
Perfect. And just before we get into some of those issues that you just raised. Now, I was watching a very old debate of Dimitri Lascaris when he was running as a member of the Green Party of Canada. And this was the final year of what was going to be actually the final year of Stephen Harper's conservative government. And one of the reasons why I wanted to have you was because you had, Dimitri Lascaris of the Green Party, you had this NDP candidate, the Liberal candidate, the Conservative Party, the Libertarian Party of Canada, and then you had these two explicitly Marxist parties, which was a member of the Communist Party of Canada and the Marxist-Leninist Party of Canada. So very briefly, can you explain to an audience what's the difference between the Communist Party of Canada and why people should join the Communist Party of Canada as opposed to the Marxist-Leninist Party of Canada?
Yeah, that's a good question. It comes up quite a bit. So the Marxist-Leninist Party of Canada, which was formerly known as the Communist Party of Canada, Marxist-Leninist, it was a separate organization. It didn't grow out of a split between the party or anything like that, but was established, I think, in the mid to late 60s, out of the student movement and the New Left. So at that time, I guess our party would be considered from the Sino-Soviet split, more on the Soviet side, and they were on the Sino side, the Chinese side. So basically, they were a Maoist organization. That's where they have their roots up until I guess the 70s and the Deng reforms, and then they sort of adopted more of the anti-revisionist Hoxhaite, this is really in the weeds sort of stuff, Albanian line until the end of Albania, and then sort of oriented themselves more towards Cuba. They tend to have I think the biggest difference is in our program. I won't go into like all the details and stuff like that. They have if I'm hopefully I'm not mischaracterizing them, because I've worked with some of them and I respect them and that, but I think the line our program envisages a sort of anti-monopoly alliance, something similar maybe to Popular Unity, although we don't see necessarily the NDP here in Canada, which is the Social Democratic Party, as being capable of being in that alliance. Although individual members can be, there are individual like progressive MPs and stuff, whereas they favor more of an approach of in Cuba after the revolution. they basically changed all of the House of Representatives and the Popular Assembly and things like that. So they envision more that through democratic reform, they can create a structure that will be able to sort of avoid the revolutionary break and thus establish it. They're putting, so it's about how they see that happening. We envision that there could be a popular government, but that the bourgeoisie will not allow the transition to socialism to occur, no matter how much we want.
So they're more of what I would call socialist reformists, which is a broad term I use for for many people, but they're more socialist reformists, whereas opposed the CPC is more revolutionary socialism.
I maybe they would disagree with that characterization. I don't know. So you can talk to them. But yeah, I mean, we do advance reforms. We want the struggle. We struggle for reforms. We make our demands. We've been active in lots of fights to expand democratic rights. For example, in the 90s, there was a famous Supreme Court case with Miguel Figueroa, our leader at the time, who's now the leader of the Canadian Peace Congress. Basically, the government was trying to get rid of our party by saying, you have to run all of these candidates in every riding. You have to do all that. So we took that fight to the Supreme Court and won it, which allowed other parties like the Greens, for example, to exist without that Supreme Court case saying no, limiting the amount of candidates that you had to run and saying it was an access to democracy issue. There wouldn't be the Green Party. There wouldn't be all these other smaller parties who have been getting larger too. So, in that case, that's not a revolutionary advance, but it is an advance that opens up a space for our party, for other smaller parties, for the left. Unfortunately, too, for the right wing, but the right wing would have money anyway. So.
And what distinct and then one final thing about this, what would distinguish the Communist Party of Canada to say the Socialist Equality Party of Canada, which follows more of the, well, not that it follows more. I mean, they are a Trotskyist organization. So what distinguishes the CPC from the SCP?
I know of them in the States, and I know there's a few in Windsor and stuff, but I actually haven't had much interaction with them. I mean, I know the World Socialist website, and I think in a way they're sort of like if my understanding is correct, they're more of an orthodox Trotskyite formation, which I think generally produces better foreign policy positions than sort of newer Trotskyite organizations who are
exactly.
Get all excited about the Syrian revolution or the Libyan revolution or whatever. So I mean, I don't know, to distinguish them. Yeah, I mean, I read the website occasionally and stuff like that. I know there's some issues about sort of like their sexual policies and things like that, but I won't go into that. But exactly. I mean, the biggest thing is I say this sort of tongue in cheek, is that like we're the largest socialist organization in the second largest country on earth, but we're very small. So I think it's a size thing. I mean, we're active in most of the provinces. We have a large club system. Probably size is one of the things. I don't really know much about their domestic policy or anything like that so I can't say, sorry.
Okay, no problem. And by the way, I think what Jay was referring to the sexual politics is probably probably refers to some of the articles they've done where they've pushed back against Michael Jackson is guilty, Roman Polanski should be hunted, and a lot of the controversy surrounding Me Too. But yeah, we're not going to get into that. And if any of the authors want to come back on the show, we've had Chris Marsden on the show, and we always welcome anyone from the World Socialist website. But okay, on to the topics at hand and the Canadian Communist Party. So the first question then I want to ask Jay is, as a communist and ergo a revolutionary socialist and radical Marxist, can you explain to an audience what are these severe limitations of a liberal democracy, especially one like Canada, which is often seen as a model for why we should have a liberal democracy, why we should have centrism, and parties like the Liberal Party ruling us indefinitely, and being a broad and being a broad church to social democrats and social democrats and progressives.
Well, I mean, the obvious limitations of any liberal democracy, but I think anybody who's familiar with Chomsky or Parenti or just watching American elections knows, which is that money is really what rules, and that the liberal in liberal democracy doesn't refer to liberal civic rights so much as it refers to the protection of private property. And I'll say, for example, this is not really well known outside of Canada, but when our government goes along and says, Venezuela is a terrible dictatorship, it's, they're making this constituent assembly, they're doing all this sort of horrible anti-democratic stuff, it's a joke coming from Canada. Our head of state is the Queen. Like it's like a German lady.
Queen of England.
In Britain is our head of state. There's other like fundamentally anti-democratic things. For example, we have an unelected Senate, which is even different than the United States. That unelected Senate has the power to bring down governments, but also to strike down legislation that comes from the House of Commons, which is elected. So there's issues there that even if you elect a progressive government, you have all of the from previous governments who have that job until they're 75. Like it's not like a 4-year term or something. It used to be for life, and then they magnanimously moved it down to 75. So even that, the Senate could just squash that right away. There's also another thing called a Privy Council. This is basically it's everybody who used to be a cabinet minister, the Queen, the representatives of the royal family, basically are in there and can make secret orders in council, which can basically run the country if they wanted to. So even if there is a progressive government that comes into this liberal democracy, its ability to do things are very hamstrung. And people say things like in Canada very often, oh, these are vestiges of a previous time. Actually, they're just symbolic.
Actually, Jake, can you repeat that? Because there was a bit of there's some that happened in the call. So yeah.
Okay, so people say, these are vestiges of colonialism. They're symbolic institutions. They don't really act in this way. I mean, we know in other instances, for example, in Grenada, which was a constitutional monarchy like us under the Maurice Bishop and New Jewel movement, the governor general there interfered directly in the politics of that country to sabotage that government. In Australia in the late 60s, the Labour government there, basically the Queen interfered in that because they didn't want to go along with Vietnam. They were taking an independent foreign policy path. And so those things, these symbolic entities, very quickly, what's the Parenti saying? You don't feel the leash until you pull at it. And in Canada, we've had a bipartisan system. There's two parties who've run the federal government, the Conservatives and the Liberals, and they have they're going to be there to protect private
property. Yeah.
Oh, I think I'm breaking up again, but
yeah, it happens.
Okay, sorry. Yeah,
you were saying that basically, like, the Liberals and the Conservative Party, previously the Progressive Conservative, but now just the Conservative Party, are basically, as I was saying, basically two rival oligarchs.
Yeah, they both have connections to different sections of capital, and both finance capital, industrial capital in the country. There's differences, just like there's differences between the Democrats and Republicans, but fundamentally they're both parties of capital. They're not parties of the working class. They're definitely not parties of Indigenous peoples in this country, who they've severely attacked in using different tactics sometimes, but both fundamentally to extinguish them as Indigenous peoples in this country.
And going and sort of a follow up to the severe limitations of a liberal democracy and why it should kind of be abolished and and replaced. I remember my history teacher, Mr. Binns, who did comparative governments class, and at the end of his class in the beginning of our history class, I was looking at his board and he was explaining what a liberal democracy is. What are the features of a liberal democracy? And one of the things it said, that he wrote on the board was the free market, and I thought to myself, well, so I thought to myself that's a bit strange. So I was asking Mr. Binns, wait a minute, to be a liberal democracy, the economic system has to be capitalism. It has to be the free market. Isn't that what a conservative democracy is? And he was saying to me, well, Youri, I've never heard of a conservative democracy. We've only had liberal democracies, and yeah, part of a liberal democracy is having the free markets. So your thoughts on that?
Well, I think he's being honest, which is that that the free market, that the protection of property is at the basis of all liberalism. This is why, I mean, libertarianism is sort of an extreme example of liberalism, right? They only want the state to do one thing, and that's to protect private property, and which is also why libertarianism can never really exist, because you need a state to protect private property. But yeah, I mean, we envision a socialist democracy, and what does that look like? Well, we've had plenty of examples. It'll be different in Canada because of the experiences of Canada. Who knows if, and this another thing too, we're in the imperialist north. Yes, capitalism is crumbling up here, but unfortunately that doesn't mean that the working class demand for socialism is immediately on the agenda. So yeah, so our vision of a socialist democracy means that we also understand that the state exists as a repressive apparatus. Currently, it's a repressive apparatus that is directed against Indigenous people, working people, oppressed minorities, people making demands on it, people who create the wealth that the rich live off, actually. And in a socialist democracy, we envision that the repressive apparatus should be used against those who lived off the labor of others. So that's sometimes people don't like to talk about it, but that's the truth.
Well, it's a conversation that needs to be had, and that's a perfect segue then to my number 2 question, which is, now many people scoff at communism. They say that it doesn't work. I think others, for the most part, are open to it, but I think are just fearful of human rights because of the human rights abuses of Stalin, Mao, and some of their successors. But the Communist Party of Canada, if it was to ever get into power, hypothetically, and you were to pitch yourselves to an audience, which by default is going to be prejudicial to your vision and your form of socialism. So how would you pitch to them that your form of socialism is much better for like you said, the workers, Indigenous people, as opposed to social democracy, because you're going to have people who say, well, we don't need to radically change the system. We can just be we could just adopt the Nordic model, like the many Scandinavian countries. And of course, Bernie Sanders always pitches his version of socialism as not the Soviet model or even the Bolivarian model, which I think is social democracy. So yeah, explain to people why they should vote for the Canadian Communist Party and adopt communism as opposed to social democracy.
Well, I think social democracy as it existed, and I don't think it exists. I don't think the Nordic model exists anymore. I'd say it's been severely impacted by neoliberalism. In fact, some of the first neoliberal reforms that were introduced outside of Chile were introduced by social democratic governments in Scandinavia. And what they said at the time was, okay, we don't totally believe in public ownership. We just believe in service delivery. And this is, it led to something like Tony Blair. Now, also, I'd say there's very specific reasons why the Nordic countries are allowed to exist as they do, or as they did rather, during capitalism. Those are related to imperialism's differentiation and the use of labor. So they have highly technical workforce, highly specialized, which means they do more of the tech labor than other countries, than even other Western European countries. Germany does more industrial stuff. So it's related to the world imperialist system, which the U.S. is at the head of. So that's really, that space was allowed during the golden age of capitalism. Basically, there was enough capital out there that could be harnessed, that needed the state basically to be put into action to save capitalism up until 1973. And then you have the inflationary crisis, you have the start of the neoliberal turn. So at this point now, I mean, we think that we're in for another crisis that's going to be on the scale of the 1930s, if not deeper. There's basically there's no place for capitalism can't tolerate social democracies because there's a crisis of profitability right now. And yes, the state is going to get involved. We see it in Canada too, but the state is getting involved basically to create a super neoliberal state, which is, neoliberalism is not the absence of the state. It's the use of the state even more for the pursuit of private profit. So, I mean, social democracy, great. This is actually, I think it's a nice idea in theory, but in practice, it depends on the global exploitation of the third world too. This is another thing we saw in, let's say, 1978 or 1981, I forget which year. In Vancouver, the Socialist International had met at the time. The Socialist International was, I'd say, a better organization in terms of its membership. The Sandinistas were involved in it. Okay, so this would be probably 81. The New Jewel Movement, which was a Marxist-Leninist organization, was in it. The FMLN in El Salvador. Many other sort of, groups that were with the non-aligned movement, so had relations with the Socialist Bloc, but also with independent Arab republics and stuff. After 1973, and the creation of OPEC, many countries in the global south said, well, why don't we do that? Look at all these raw materials that are being taken out of our countries. Like, this is ridiculous. We should band together and set the prices so that we can make money for that. The people who ran the Socialist International, talking about Willy Blunt from West Germany, Ed Broadbent from the NDP, Michael Harrington from the Democratic Socialists at the time, were freaking out about that idea because they had basically aligned with the Western Bloc during the Cold War. Occasionally they would, try to be close to the Sandinistas only in order to keep them away from the Cubans and Soviets, not because they had any interest in their liberation, but because they were playing, a more sophisticated role as part of the imperialist bloc. So when they saw this, they were freaking out because this is like, well, the success of all of our social democratic governments depends on the raw materials coming from these other countries. And so the Global South parties and the Socialist International called them out for it. It was a big issue in this Vancouver conference. Anyways, they ended up getting screwed by different negotiations. So at the end, it turned out that the Global South parties signed, along with the Northern South parties, an agreement where they said, oh, we'll never band together in these cartels and deny ourselves raw materials or resources or financial aid from. Basically, it's supposed to look like a dual benefits agreement, but fundamentally it locked in all of these other members of the Socialist International and the Global South from being able to do what they should have done, which led to the debt crises of the 1980s, with many countries having to take IMF loans and stuff like that. So this is what social democracy does, and this is what it's been like, unfortunately, since Lenin's time, but especially during the Cold War. Social democrats. I think it was Stephen Lewis from the NDP here, was big with the Socialist International. He had said, we're more interested in the liberal democracy than the socialist part, and that's the truth. Their social democracy is one way to save capitalism, and we don't want to save capitalism. And I don't think it's going to be able to be saved. Hopefully, we'll be able to save ourselves before it destroys us and the world.
I also have to say this about the Nordic countries and everyone who always paints, Sweden, Denmark, Norway as, wonderful, peace-loving countries. If you're a member of NATO, no. You're a partner in crime to the Anglo-American Empire. And all this stuff that they're much more tolerant, and that's because of their socialism. I would say, again, it's very limited because much of the wealth of those countries was off the back of their own colonialism. People need to check out the Sami people, and that will completely demolish this mythology that the Nordic countries are much more tolerant and are the models of socialism that everybody should emulate, right?
And when let's say there are honest social democrats. I accept that honest social democrats exist. I don't think everybody's cynical and terrible. But when somebody like Olof Palme exists, he was assassinated pretty quickly, and he was assassinated because he was talking about independent foreign policies, about not being anti-communist, about working with national liberation movements, and he's dead now. So.
And you mentioned, you mentioned Gough Whitlam, who was sacked. he was a social democrat, and he was literally sacked in an Anglo-American coup, which the real head of state, the Queen, signed off on.
Yeah. So I don't know. Yeah. So I think I'll go back to one question because I think it's important, and I don't want to skip it over, which is the comparison to what happened in the Stalin era or in the Mao-Tse era.
Right ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I think it's important, and I don't like to skirt off of it or say, oh, don't worry, like, no, our socialism is going to be so different. No, I'll say this honestly. I think the problems of the Stalin era were problems that that were encountered because of the socialist problems of socialist construction. So will the problems that we're going to face in Canada be similar? Not entirely, because we're a developed capitalist country. The Soviet Union was pushing for industrialization basically because they knew the fascist, the war was coming. So there was a lot of mistakes that were made. But I think honestly, I can say that, and people saw this when they opened up the Soviet archives after the fall of the Soviet Union, after the counter-revolution, which was that these weren't cynical, evil people. These were people who believed in what they were doing. Did they make fundamental mistakes? Yes, of course they did. Will we make fundamental mistakes? I think so. I hope that we'll have some of the space there because of the development of capitalism already, and because of other things. That means that they won't be as deep because we won't have to deal with it. But fundamentally, these are the issues of socialist construction, especially in underdeveloped countries. So when people say stuff like that, I'm like, okay, do you want to have a long conversation? Like, I don't think everybody in the party is so excited about doing this, but I think it's an honest thing to say that I'm not going to brush off this period and say, oh, don't worry, we'll just be better. We'll just do it differently or something like that, like as if that's so easy. And I don't like it when people, compare the problems of Cuba or something like that and say, I'm socialist, but I'm not like that. Like, you're a socialist in what sense then? If you're not learning from these things either, if you just say that they're as if you wouldn't run into those same mistakes yourself. Like, I think it's a moralistic and sort of unfortunate thing that people do. And also I would say too that there is, we live in an anti-communist society. And if the Stalin era didn't happen, it would be, and whoever was leader, if it was Trotsky who was the leader there, the same anti-communist like stuff would be pushed onto him. It doesn't matter. We're in a capitalist system that capital will do whatever it wants. People of the global south know this, and people, indigenous people, capital do whatever it wants. Lying is the least of the sins that capital is going to do. They'll do a lot worse things if you talk about like Operation Condor in Latin America. So, that's, anyways, sorry, I'm ranting.
No, before I even get into the third question, let's, this actually was a question I actually wanted to talk to you about, which is, can you talk to us about the persecution of communists in Canada, and because everybody knows the Red Scare of Woodrow Wilson and previous governments before him, and everybody knows about McCarthyism when Joseph McCarthy and his toxic legacy, came about. Still is very much alive in and well in in the U.S. And there was a McCarthy period in Britain. There was even a McCarthy period in Australia. So talk to us actually about the persecution of communists, and by and so talk to us about the persecution of communists in Canada, and how actually this and how actually the CPC helped people power movements in Canada, but of course never gets any credit for it because everybody has to say, "Oh, I'm a socialist, not a communist," or "I'm for social democracy, but not like in Venezuela."
Yeah. So, well, I think, just like you mentioned the Woodrow Wilson Red Scare, we had that in Canada too. So 2 years before the establishment of our party in 1919, there was the Winnipeg General Strike, which basically pitted the workers of Winnipeg against capital. And at that point, there was a period where the workers were running that city. So of course, capital freaked out, capital crushed it. And so when our party was founded, it was founded because it was founded in conditions of illegality. We say basically workers' organizations were banned at that time. Many unions, any sort of like activity. It was very racialized too. A lot of Eastern European and Jewish people in Canada were involved in that. Were considered to be, bomb-throwing Bolsheviks, scary Judeo-Bolshevists, all that sort of like hideous racist stuff that comes out in fascism was part and parcel of the Canadian, let's say, political landscape. So we were illegal. We've been made illegal 3 times. Another time, I guess, so in the 20s, capitalism in Canada or whatever, we didn't yet have the crisis, although there was still quite a few problems and there was lots of labor activities. So we were instrumental in establishing a lot of the industrial union activity here, similar to what the CPUSA did with the CIO. So by the 1930s, we're still illegal as well. Our members were routinely getting arrested, put in jail. Tim Buck, our leader, and 7 other leaders were put in Kingston Penitentiary. They tried to assassinate him. They shot into his cell a number of times. He was finally let free, and our party was quite large at that time. In the 1930s was some of the biggest struggles that we had, and that was around because of obviously the Great Depression. We organized the On to Ottawa Trek, which was people who were working in relief camps and the unemployed to make a demand that led to the creation of employment insurance. So that's another, it's a revolutionary party still trying to advance reforms within capitalism to make people's lives better. In 1940s, because of World War II, our party was made illegal again then. So many people were thrown into camps along with
in World War II, members of the Communist Party were actually thrown in jail, even though there was an alliance between Canada and the Soviet Union.
Yeah, our party was illegal. So people were thrown into jail. Sometimes they were thrown into jail with fascists, when we're living in the same camps as fascists, basically. And obviously the camp guards and what would like turn a blind eye to the violence of the fascists, but like any sort of self-defense or anything the communists did was not good for them. After World War II, in 1946, so we had to go underground as the party, and we had an above ground party called the Labour Progressive Party. After World War II, this was still the case. It wasn't until I think 1956 or so, maybe 1954, that we were able to be not illegal again. But at that point, we're kind of at the height of the Cold War. So we had MPs elected at the time. We have in the Member of Parliament, one of them, Fred Rose, was accused of spying. Basically, was sent back to Poland. Almost could have been for his death if it wasn't for the fact that there was a socialist Poland at the time. I don't know. And then there was just general McCarthyism, right? Like there's a member of my club, my neighborhood club here, my party neighborhood club, Fran. She's about 80 years old. She was being a communist and she was very young. She remembers, when she would go to get a job, or she'd be working a job, and the RCMP would show up and say, "Hey, that person's a communist," and get her fired. They would follow people around. We know now because of declassified documents that there was a program called ProFunk, which kept lists of everybody they suspected who was communists or communist sympathizers. This included Tommy Douglas, because once they had said at the University of Chicago.
Tommy Douglas, in case people don't know, Tommy Douglas was he was the leader of the NDP. Which is the Social Democratic Party of Canada, and often the third major party. Yeah, go ahead.
So they had a secret plan that was in place until the late 1980s, basically in the event of some sort of state of emergency, they would round up every single one of these people, and they had camps already built and things set up. Here it was going to be, I think, Castle Frank, which is a sort of Toronto tourist kind of area or whatever, is going to be one of the places. So I mean, there's and just general, anti-communist attacks in the media. So I mean, have we faced repression as severe as communists in the global south? No, certainly not. And I wouldn't want to give the impression that's been our experience either. Especially because we have a lot of people who come from parties in the global south who move to Canada and then have very severe experiences of just grotesque repression, whether from the Chilean party, lots of Latin American parties and stuff like that. But the experience has not been one of a pluralistic liberal democracy that allows space for all voices and stuff like that. That's for sure. So yeah.
So that persecution of thought towards towards people who were sincerely who were sincerely communists. Did that and that existed throughout the 60s, the 70s, including the 80s then as well, or?
I'd say even now, it's not illegal for you to be fired. There's no charter protection, which the Charter of Rights and Freedoms is sort of like our Bill of Rights. There's no charter protection if you're to be discriminated against as a communist. You can be fired just because you're a communist still in this country. And it's gone to the Supreme Court and they said that's fine. You can't be fired if you're a Christian or you're a Jehovah's Witness or if you're anything like that, which is fine. I agree with that too. But I think it should be extended to, political rights in this country are kind of a farce.
Wow, that is incredible. And go and explain some of the explain more of the accomplishments of very fragile gains that the Communist Party was involved in, which the Communist Party gets no credit for whenever there's International Workers' Day and Labor Day.
Yeah, the establishment of trade unionism in the industrial sector in the 1930s. Also, after World War II, a lot of communists were involved in Quebec and in the rest of Canada with the establishment of public sector unions. So for crown corporations, for ministries, things like that, for healthcare. We were the first party to advocate for universal healthcare. Dr. Norman Bethune, who ended up in the Spanish Civil War and then ended up fighting with Mao-Tse in China, was instrumental in establishing the first campaign for universal healthcare in Canada, which was one. It's not totally one. We don't have dental coverage. We don't have mental health coverage. There's other things and stuff, but in some ways we do. That's a tangible material benefit. I'd say, I came back from Cuba once and was feeling like really dehydrated and weird on the airport, and then couldn't walk when I got off and went to the hospital. It was my appendix. I had it taken out. It cost me $10. And that was for the rental of the phone in my room. I know people in the States that could cost $30,000. This could indebt somebody. So, that's something that we do have in Canada, which we help fight for. I'd say one thing that I think we do get credit for, which I'm glad of, is we do try to center internationalism in all of our work, understanding that we're a communist party in the global north, that we have responsibilities because of what our governments, what our corporations do abroad, especially Canadian mining corporations, which are 70% of the world's Canadian mining corporations are Canadian. We have more capital involved in Africa than China does in mining, like by far. Yet nobody talks about that, or if they do talk about it, it's maybe individual cases. Oh, Barrick Gold had a rape gang in this country because it's just so incredibly awful that people have to talk about it, but they don't understand that actually this grew out of the last situation when there was a minority government in the 1970s with the Liberals supported by the NDP, as there is right now. The NDP was pushing for a program called Canadianization. Pierre Trudeau, who was the father of the current prime minister, so many parallels there, agreed with it because at the time we had maybe 2 mining companies that were based in Canada. One was Rio Tinto or Alcan at the time, which was involved in bauxite mines in Jamaica. So they really wanted to make Canada a mining destination. So they changed a lot of the rules, changed a lot of the royalty rates and stuff like that. They could have established a public sector mining operation. That would have been fine. But no, they wanted capital to come here, and they wanted then capital to be able to come out from Canada. So they basically, the Canadian state set up what we have now, which is the world's largest mining apparatus, basically. And we see how violent and how terrible that is. But that came from an ostensible social democratic policy of like a social democratic industrial policy.
Who was the NDP leader at the time?
I believe it was David Lewis or Stephen Lewis. Stephen Lewis, I think Stephen Lewis.
Wow. Stephen Lewis, who later became like a UN guy under Brian Mulroney of the PC, right?
Yeah, yeah. So, you know your Canadian politics. I'm very impressed.
Yeah.
I'm sad for you. I'm sad for you to have to follow it, but I'm impressed.
Well, one of the reasons why I started 1+1 was because I was actually really tired of always hearing about American politics and America's role in the world, British politics and Britain's role in the world. And I said to myself, why not do a topical interview program where we actually talk, yes, we will talk about that, but we also talk, but we want to also talk about, Canada and so forth. So yeah, so I've had Eve Engler as a guest several times since Dimitri.
Yeah, he's great.
Stephen Lewis, who actually, that's a perfect segue then So continuing on talking about the very severe limitations of social democracy. So talk to an audience about if they really wanted to really change the world and had revolutionary change, why the NDP is not the place for it, is not the place for them to go.
I think it's been hollowed out already. I'd say there are good people in the NDP who believe that the party can be returned to socialism. I don't think that's the case. I mean, we know from our party's experience that a lot of people who were involved in trying to destroy our party in the 90s, either from within or from without, have moved into the NDP. Or the national director of the NDP, Anne McGrath, she used to be in the Communist Party. We know these people have no interest in socialism, that nobody who runs the NDP on a provincial or federal level who works there, the actual people who operate the NDP have no interest in that. It's not a democratic party by any sense of the imagination. You can follow what they do to people who challenge things from the left. In my own riding here, Seren Gebrselassie, who is an incredible activist, a lawyer, like a progressive lawyer. She made a real case. Actually, this goes back to the Lewis family, because Stephen Lewis and his wife are living in this neighborhood. Canada's very small, especially politically, so you kind of like run into everybody if you're in the politics. She last election was making a case from the left that she wanted to be the NDP's candidate here. Basically, she signed up a whole bunch of people in order to get support, people who traditionally wouldn't be in the NDP, a large black community here as well. So signed up a lot of people, was making a real race. The NDP had already decided that they wanted Paul Taylor as the candidate here. There was another guy, Tom Parkins, who was running, who was more the riding association sort of pick, the executive of the riding association sort of pick. In their ways, just sort of lefty liberal kind of people. But Seren Gebrselassie was somebody who had run as the mayor for the mayor in the last mayoral race. Often placed third in working class areas. Is very intelligent, very smart. Advocated for a lot of good progressive reforms. Was going to also be somebody that the NDP couldn't control. So by the time the vote for the nomination came up, all of a sudden these people who came up who supported Seren were turned away. They said, "Oh, there's been a problem. You didn't pay by credit card, so you're not actually registered as a member," and they squashed her. And that was, under the orders of Stephen Lewis and his wife, who are at the head of the riding association here, because they had a candidate that they wanted already. We've seen in many other nomination race, if somebody says something about Palestine, they're not going to be a candidate anymore for the NDP. We've seen in their policy conventions that this is a very telling thing. Last policy convention, there was a groundswell of support for Palestinian rights to talk about BDS at this convention, basically. So people a good amount of people, I'd say probably 200 delegates or something like that, or people supporting that were trying to get this pushed on the agenda. They couldn't do it. Who did stop something else from being discussed? There was another motion to be discussed about republicanism. Two members of the Young Monarchist League of Canada, who look to be like 20 years old or so, were able to, because they're on riding associations and good with the party brass, able to get it knocked off the agenda for being talked about. So you have a case here where teenage monarchists have more power in that party to influence policy than pro-Palestinian activists. Supporting BDS, which is generally supported, maybe not a hard kernel of support, but is generally supported by most of the Canadian public. So they also have another thing too, which is that the convention that's made at their policies is not considered binding on the party to run for. It's considered to be advice. I'll say this, having just gone through a convention with the Communist Party, we are way more democratic, sometimes to a fault, I'd say, because there's a lot of arguing. But when we go to convention, when the members put it out and fight it out, that becomes binding on the party. The party cannot decide that they just want to ignore it and then we're going to do something else. This is not the case with the NDP. So you have a case where even if you're able to get past all of the hurdles that they put in front of you, get something won at the convention level, the NDP can just say, "Oh well, that's advice. We don't have to do that."
And two things, following up that, because we mentioned, Stephen Lewis's name, is that when the NDP had this block of of members called the Waffles, who were a bunch of Eve is more critical of them. He describes them more as left nationalists, but here are a bunch of socialist reformers, and even socialist reformers who actually believe that Canada is a colony of America and wanted to actually team up with Canadian business to overthrow American capitalism as the best way forward for a socialist Canada. So you would think that the NDP, which is a socialist reformist party, it's a social democratic party. It does not want the abolishment of capitalism. It just wants to tightly regulate capitalism. Yeah. So you would think that a group like the Waffles, they would embrace them with open arms, but no. Hacks like Stephen Lewis kicked them out of the party.
Yeah, they did. There was members of the Laxer family who was Robert Laxer was in our party, and then his sons were involved in that. But I mean, this is another thing too, is that, and this happens. This is the perennial case with the left in Canada, which is like, at least in Greece, when PASOK was shown to be bereft of any ideas, I hate Syriza, but at least they went and made a new party. In Canada, the thing is like, oh, we need the waffle again. Oh, we need to support, Nikki Ashton or this progressive leader, and then everything will be good. Then we'll go back to being a socialist party. And the entire history of the NDP is one of sliding to the right and one of destroying the left and minimizing it. Sven Robinson, who was a great MP, was a friend of Cuba, was very critical of even the NDP's foreign policy when he was in Parliament. He's a great socialist reformist. He went down to Chile and directly castigated one of the newspapers there that was a Pinochet supporting paper. He's a very brave, wonderful man. At that time, in the 90s, he ran for a leadership race. He won on the first ballot. They maneuvered and got him out on the second ballot. He got about, 54% of support. But we see now the NDP has fundamentally changed that. Yes, there are socialists in that party, but the last left challenge in the leadership race was Nikki Ashton, who positions herself as on the left of the party. I think there are issues. She did vote twice to bomb Libya, not a very left international vote in my mind. She got 19% of support. So we see that the actual let's say hard left vote within the NDP is minimizing, and that's because on the provincial level, it's a party of business and a party of capital. In the place, in BC right now, there's an NDP government that attacks the Wet'suwet'en Indigenous people in order to advance pipelines. Has done it even a couple of decades ago with the Gustafson Lake. Sent in the military against them. So this is what the NDP is, and the NDP honestly keeps telling people and showing people what it is. It's sad that a lot of the Canadian left is trapped in it.
Yeah, and doesn't the NDP in their party constitution mean, didn't they actually get rid of the fact that we're a democratic socialist or social democratic party? So even that's not.
So yeah, they changed the preamble to their constitution. I forget what it was before. I think it was something about advancing to a socialist Canada or being a socialist party. And now it says, we're inspired by social democratic and democratic socialist ideas, like something to that effect. Basically, socialism's off the agenda. I'll bring this back though. They've never actually had a really good conception of socialism, anyways. At their first founding convention, with the Canadian Labour Congress I think it would be the 1960s, when they were, when they're coming up with the new party. And again, the party is neither new nor democratic, but it is a party. Charles Taylor, who's a philosopher and who was big in the party at the time, had basically said that because in the post-war period the state was so involved, in Keynesian, basically Keynesianism, building, there was public ownership, they're doing that. This is for the benefit of capital. But because the state was so involved, that basically Canada was already socialist. And that the difference would be, if the progressive conservatives were in power, it'd just be what kind of socialism they were making. And the liberals are in power, what kind of socialism they were doing. But if the NDP, it'd be the good kind of socialism. And so, I mean, they have like a theoretically bizarre idea of what socialism is, which is the government does things. Unfortunately, this is a very established view, and I think it's consciously pushed out there to stop people talking about from what I would say is actually existing socialism.
Interesting. And the NDP is also hostile when Thomas Mulcair was leader. They were also hostile to the Leave Manifesto, and ironically, Avi Lewis, the son of Stephen Lewis, was part of that. So it must make for interesting dinner conversations. So then. So that's a perfect segue then to this. So going on with this theme that we're talking about, which is why we need to get rid of the capitalist system. Can you explain how the ruling Liberal government's response in Canada has been to the ongoing coronavirus crisis? And how does their lackluster response, because I know you're going to be critical of their response to the coronavirus crisis, how does the response of the ruling government of Canada, as well as what the World Socialist website would call the pseudo-left's response, make the case that we need a radically different system like what you advocate, as opposed to a reformed system of capitalism / social democracy?
I'll start with an anecdote. So we have a party member who's been teaching in China for a while, as lots of people in Canada go and do that. In China, which we can argue about whether it's socialist or not, I think they don't even declare themselves socialist. They say they're working towards it. I generally take a more positive view than some other people on it. So they closed down his schools. He's about maybe a couple hours from Wuhan. And he was able to come back. He saw the quarantine there and the experience of it and stuff like that. And then he was able to come back because they had closed the schools. So he wanted to come visit his family and stuff. So he stayed in quarantine for 14 days. On the 15th day, he bought a ticket and left Canada because he saw the response here to COVID was so bizarre and lackluster, as you would say, compared to what he experienced in the People's Republic of China, which is like an all-out mobilization of the state, of civil society, to say we're going to get rid of this, which they almost fundamentally have. I mean, and the lessons that they learned compared to, you look at Vietnam, 1 death, neighboring China, like, it's terrific. In Canada, because things are run for the benefit of private profit, there's never been a coherent response at the federal or the provincial levels. And that's why we're going in right now. Just this week, all of this new second wave is happening. Because we're next to the States, maybe we look good. This is generally the case for a lot of things, but that doesn't mean
yeah, exactly. The Canada always gets away with doing that. Canada, I mean, how propaganda works in Canada, and it's it's an ingenious propaganda system. What you have in Canada is that we're not as bad as the States. We're a better version of the States. We're the good cousins of Great Britain.
Yeah, basically, which is a total sham. So I think one of the key things of the Liberals' response, well, there's two key things. One of the key things was the CERB, Canadian Emergency Response Benefit, basically that was $2,000 a month to a large group of people. That's ending now. It's being turned into a different benefit. The NDP has decided to support the Liberals, or said they did, because instead of it being reduced to $400 a week, it'd be kept at $500 a week. Although tons of people are going to be thrown off of that, maybe 1.5 million people, which is significant. Canada's a small country; it's 30 million people or so.
Because it's peanuts and very inadequate.
It is very inadequate, and of course, compared to the States, it's better. But $2,000 a month in a city like Toronto it doesn't cover the rent for a one-bedroom. We're seeing lots of evictions being scheduled. We're seeing, and fundamentally what it is, $2,000 a month, it's a landlord subsidy. It's subsidizing your rent, basically. So I know it has helped people, and I don't want to diminish the fact that it exists, but it exists in a half-assed sort of way, and it was never fundamentally about, it was about ensuring that it wasn't, that things aren't going to be as bad as the States, especially because it was introduced right around the Black Lives Matter protests, the uprising, let's say, actually, the uprisings in the summer. Capital here tends to be pretty sophisticated, knows that, okay, we've got to give something so that we're not going to have, social deconstruction or social chaos right now. So another thing they did, and the other thing too, is both of these programs will be funded out of taxes, and taxes in Canada, the burden of taxation in Canada is on the working class by far. Corporations pay very little tax, businesses pay very little tax. It's the working class. So this is the ruling class deciding that we're going to give out a chunk of the working class's money back to itself. The other thing they put in was the wage subsidy program. This was put forth by the NDP working with the Canadian Federation of Independent Businesses, which is like a AstroTurf organization set up by Capital to say, oh, we're representing the small restaurateur, the mom and pop shop. But no, it basically is subsidizing 70 to 80% of the wages. So this is the working class, which already creates all the wealth, paying taxes in order to pay to the corporations. And we've seen experiences. One of the companies was a private long-term care home, and that's where there's been most of the COVID deaths in these private long-term care homes where senior citizens live. They used it to pay out massive dividends to their shareholders. They were like, we've had a great time. This subsidy is amazing. Now we don't have to spend the money on wages here. We're giving it to the shareholders. So what we're seeing in Canada, I would say, rather than some sort of return to Keynesianism or some sort of deluded idea that social democrats have about things are changed, now the government's going to do stuff. No, we're seeing a creation of a neoliberal superstate where the government does take an active involvement, but it's not promoting public ownership. It's not promoting expanded social services. It's supporting things like a pseudo basic income, because in order to advance a privatization agenda afterwards, to get rid of social services, you get rid of social services, you privatize. That means you get rid of some of the strongest unions in this country, ones who have been able to win gains for people. So it's been very distressing to see people on the left have these ideas. Naomi Klein, let's say, Jim Stanford, who's an economist, that, oh, this is great, like Canada's taken a progressive, we're going to be New Zealand or something like that. Like, no, it's not the case. We've seen what's happened. Is the smaller businesses are getting eaten up by the larger businesses. Billionaires in this country are making more money than ever before, hand over fist. They're consolidating their power. Finance capital is going in and putting in, is eating up all of these things. This creates very dangerous conditions, because we know petit bourgeois people, they vacillate between the bourgeois and the proletariat. And when they're proletarianizing, their first impulse is going to be towards fascism, because we don't have a developed class consciousness in this country or a workers' movement. And unfortunately, the labor unions have not been playing a good role, let's say a more aggressive role like they should, to protect people, even though historically, let's say in the past 3 or 4 years, when there's a strike vote, 10 years ago, it might be you barely win it by 60%. Now we're seeing that the working class is radicalized in a sense. They're giving votes of 90%. We can see that means there's an appetite for labor to do something, but unfortunately, it's not always doing it.
Wow, that is shocking. And another follow-up, I have to say, about what you just laid out, which is a much more grim picture than how it's depicted in the media, because I think even the Canadian left-leaning media is also guilty of this is that, like, even though they hate the Liberal Party, and they rightly see the Liberal Party as a rival oligarch party, because they still have this devotion to the NDP, to the NDP. It's like, anytime the NDP, because the NDP rhetorically attacks the Liberals from the left. When you look at the leadership race, the NDP's always attacking the Liberals from the left, whereas the Conservatives are always attacking the Liberals from both the left and and the right. And and it still is depicted as, okay, yes, we all hate Justin Trudeau, but his response to COVID is much better, obviously, than Boris Johnson's response, Bolsonaro's response, or or Trump's response. But
the lowest bar possible.
But that being said, it's like when Eve Engler criticizes Canadian foreign policy. It's damning with faint praise, because what kind of some progressive governments, like like the Liberals, how they're still they're doing the whole back to work, back to school thing. And when you have a highly infectious disease like like COVID-19, people should not be exposing themselves by going to school, by going to work. But the Liberals are still doing that with the support of the Quebec Bloc and the NDP, and still you have people just kind of giving them a slap on the wrist, right?
And it's highly differentiated too. I mean, it's who are the workers who are being put out in front, who are dealing with this shit. I ride the subway here a lot during what is technically the rush hour, I guess, and you can tell it's racialized people. It's not like the white office workers who can like work from home, who have the ability to do that. There's still people out there on the front lines, and they're being exposed to this. And there's been a couple of sort of handouts to the grocery stores at once where like, we'll give you $1 or $2 an hour raise for dealing with this. And they're already making like $14 an hour, which is, I mean, this is our dollar is worth a lot less, so it's very low compared to the U.S. So if Americans are listening, it's not even as good as that. Yeah, I mean it's been pathetic, and we can see like in a city like Toronto, where COVID spreads is where racialized communities are congregated, working class racialized communities are congregated. And this is we all know capitalism runs on racism too. But so I think, yeah, there's not a lot of awareness, I would say, in the Canadian corporate media or the Canadian state media like CBC about this. There are occasionally some stories, but that's not the story that's being told. And the story that's being told a lot more now too is that, well, we got to keep things open. Well, we can't shut down the economy. We can't do all that. Maybe this is true. Maybe capitalism fundamentally can't deal with it. I would probably agree that it can't, but that it never even tried says something, I think.
And you mentioned about China. Now China, of course. Now I'm no fan of the current Chinese government. I'm not even a fan of of Mao's government. But I also have a friend that actually lives in Wuhan, just like the story you were mentioning. And I didn't get the chance to talk to her about it, but she was saying to me, Youri, don't believe any of the bad stories are reading in the press about how China's been incompetent and ineffectual in combating coronavirus. She said that when they did the lockdown, yeah, it looks pretty extreme, but that's basically how they combat it. And she says that like after several weeks, she was fine to go to university and do her daily life without a curfew or anything like that. So actually talk to us about if your friend gave more insight about how the Chinese and the Vietnamese response to coronavirus is actually what Canada and the Western world actually should have adopted.
Well, I mean, one of the interesting things, we did a couple of webinars with people here too. There's a member of the Chinese party who's living here, who's a member of our party too as well. So she did a webinar about that. I can send you some links and stuff. And Peter, who has mentioned,
please do. That'd be interesting to watch.
He wrote an article about it as well. I think he was on one of the Sputnik shows talking about it. I mean, the experience was just a total mobilization, right? As you mentioned, yeah, they shut everything down. But they also made sure that people got food, as you know, and especially in Vietnam, there was free food delivery. Or in China, they mobilized the public health system. They basically, they were shutting down factories and saying you've got to make protective personal equipment. They shut down factories when they were making it, and then it turned out they weren't supplying it to the state. They were trying to sell it off somewhere else. They would shut it down and expropriate the factory. They were able to mobilize the neighborhood committees. It was similar to like the committees of the defense of the revolution that they have in Cuba, which are neighborhood organizations that you help, basically an extension of the state, but organized by people within their communities for provision of services, budgeting, and things like that. In China, they mobilize those to get people out to do contact tracing, to do all the things that we know, everyone knows what you need to do now at this point. This is ridiculous watching people just skirt around. It shows so starkly how, if you don't want to call it a socialist country, you call it, let's say it is a country run by a socialist party, at least that. But you can see how the response has been, and it's determined by the numbers now, right? And Cuba is starting to open up once again. They've had a little bit more problems, I think, than Vietnam and China, but
because of sanctions, because of the embargo.
Yeah, exactly. Like there's still some sanctions on Vietnam, but it was changed in the 90s, et cetera, et cetera. So there are issues there, but still, even that, I mean, you can't compare Cuba to any of the other Latin American countries, or even Nicaragua, which is still a capitalist economy, but run by the Sandinistas, a socialist party. Their response has been incredible. I don't know. It's just so if you're following anything, and a lot of people don't get international news, which is very unfortunate. I'm glad that you and other people are out there like talking about this stuff, because I think this is the missing thing in the Western left, outside of communist parties, which tend to be very small, is a real sense of internationalism, and that comes with not following necessarily what Jacobin says about some other country, but following people there and what the left in those countries is saying. So,
and do you think the fact that China, because I mean the Chinese have always described their form of communism as as socialism with Chinese characteristics. I think that's how they sort of describe their system, right? Yeah. Because to have an alternative system to capitalism, that means that yes, they allow some version of the free market, but when an awful pandemic like this happens, which I'm sure internally they would say, yeah, this is because of our free market policies, but they're allowed to suspend the rules of capitalism to say, okay, we need to suspend the rules of capitalism so that we can defeat this pandemic. Whereas all of us, when in Belgium and other places, we had the lockdown, the confinement. I wasn't allowed to go into Brussels for a period of time, and we saw the numbers were going down. But then, because of this ridiculous logic of capitalism, we always have to be making money, and our economy is going to crash if we suspend the rules of capitalism. Therefore, everybody, yes, we have a highly infectious diseases, but go to work, go to school, go to bars, and but wear a hospital mask, and we hope you don't get sick. Yeah. Your thoughts on that?
Well, I think you're exactly right. I think you point to one thing that differentiates China as, you could say it's a social democracy or something like that. But the one thing that really differentiates China is that it went through a revolution. It liquidated the bourgeoisie, and sometimes in terms of liquidated them as humans, but also in terms of their power. And that the forms of capital that exist, that there are billionaires they're a little different. People don't really understand that a lot of them are built on debt and not really actual paper billionaires, but they're still under the control of the state. The state controls the commanding heights of the economy, and it can override the interest of domestic capital or even international capital. Sometimes it's dicey. I think what's happening right now with regards to the sort of attacks on China are because there's a fundamental recognition that there's not really capitalism as let's say as Western countries understand it, or as Western capital wants there to be in China. They have the power to mobilize the state, to mobilize the people, and do what they want to do. And this pandemic just reveals that they're able to do it. Can capitalist countries do it? Maybe not, but they're not really trying.
Do you think it's wrong to characterize then the Chinese economic system as like Indonesia or other Asian countries, which depend a lot on cheap labor. Now, China does. I mean, one of the reasons why their economy grows is because they did allow a lot of cheap labor, and of course, there's lots of human rights abuses. But because of what you just said about how the Chinese state still controls a lot of the mechanisms of the economy, that's why they're not as much of a puppet to Western interests compared to, say, Indonesia under Suharto or the Philippines under Marcos.
Yeah. Well, I would say that what China did, and this was a problem of China being underdeveloped as a country in the 1970s. They, after experiencing the Great Leap Forward, which was sort of a voluntarist, sort of like, we're just going to do it kind of thing. And socialist countries, this is why it's important, I think, not to moralize about things, but to look at why they did that. That sort of like ultra left approach really led to a lot of problems. This happened in Cuba during the big sugar cane, where they were gonna harvest 10 million tons. Basically, they focused only on doing that to the detriment of the broader economy, and they did not make their target, and it was a disaster. So they followed a different path after that. So the Chinese, I think, made let's say a devil's bargain in some way. They said, what do we have in China? They didn't have an oil. They don't have oil source. They don't like things like that. So how were they going to develop? What did they have? They had a lot of labor. And if they could invite capital in, one of the things that bedeviled the Soviet Union for so long too was the issue of technology transfer. They could industrialize to a certain point, but there was technologies that they were just not able to get because the capitalist world did not want to deal with them. So the Chinese, by doing this, were able to develop very rapidly, especially through not as much through the 80s, but especially through the 90s. I think they could have followed another path and done it too as well, but this is a way they were able to do it. I think there's twists and turns. I think the Xi Jinping era is a lot different than the two eras that preceded it before it. And what we're seeing now is the creation of a middle class. There's the working class in China has wages equivalent to Western Europe. In like Portugal, yes, but maybe not France, but it's getting there. And so in this case, we're not seeing the immiseration of the working class of China, even though there are human rights abuses, there are labor issues, there's anything that happens when you're doing a massive project of industrialization like this. The 30s industrialization of the Soviet Union was not a good time for everybody. And industrialization never is. But China is doing something that the Western countries took 500 years to do in a couple of decades. And they're succeeding, I would say. And so this is a big issue for capital, is to see another model, even as though, I think I'm skipping out here.
Yeah, it's good again.
Okay, all right. So I mean, capitalism is seeing, as it's going through crisis after crisis, a crisis of profitability. The reason why the rent is so expensive here in Toronto is because all the housing they make are condos that are turned around and flipped, that lots of them are empty because they're the only reliable rate of return for investment right now. Capitalism isn't going out and making factories and giving people jobs and things like that. It's looking for a way to get as much profits as possible, and that's with speculation, and that creates a bubble that's going to collapse at some point, that's going to burst at some point. And so I think the crisis of capitalism was always on the agenda, but COVID has just hastened it.
Wow, fascinating. And wow, very fascinating. I learned so much there. And
sorry, I feel like I'm unloading on you.
No. That was fantastic because because again, like, I'm not a fan of of the Chinese system, but that being said, I don't suffer from anti-China derangement syndrome, and I'm not like other leftists who are supporting the protests in Hong Kong. And a lot of times, you have to, and a lot of times, I think you have to sometimes be very, very skeptical when you see demon stories about about countries like China, in which they're depicting that their situation of the coronavirus is absolute hellhole, and that they did terribly in their response to coronavirus. Just like you have to be very skeptical of political, people who are deemed political dissenters in Russia. And of course, because we're so obsessed with, is he a good guy? Is it a bad guy? Putin bad guy. So therefore, the people who are against him must be good guys. the Chinese government not exactly, swell people, so therefore the people of Hong Kong must be the people who are protesting. But no, it's much more complicated than that. And that being said, we should always take whatever our Western corporate media, state or corporate media are saying with a grain of salt, because I know Eve's experience with Haiti and my experience when I've actually gone deeper into the propaganda against Venezuela, Bolivia, or even Ukraine. Yeah, it's always much more much more complicated than that. We're the good guys of the West, as opposed to they're the bad guys. And that is a perfect segue into this question, which is Belarus.
Yes.
Belarus. I'll just summarize it very quickly. Yeah, basically, it's been sort of a one-party state for a long period of time. Alexander Lukashenko. He's described as the last communist of Europe, the last dictator of Europe, and there was a very highly contested election in which the Western powers to be and the pseudo left say that he cheated, and now there's all these people power protests, and like I just said, Jay, when I'm looking at Western media, whether it's like pro EU funded media and all of that, that's always when I'm like, okay, the imperialists are at it again. So why do you think people who describe themselves as anti-war, anti-imperialists should be opposed to the efforts to oust the current leader of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko?
It's so obvious about the encirclement of Russia and about trying to destroy. Well, the encirclement of Russia is one, the geopolitical aspect, and the second aspect is that because it still does have remnants of the socialist system through the government control of resources, which is that capitalism, if it can't build something, it'd rather steal it. And so that's a very attractive state apparatus with lots of resources. We saw what Russia went through in the 1990s. One of the reasons why Putin is still widely popular and actually does win elections is because he went a little bit further in trying to grapple some of that back, and whether it's Gazprom or even retaining universal health care, things like that. He's more at the head of a coalition of, let's say, left nationalists, some neoliberals, some oligarchs, than he is, there are competing interests that support him, just like there are different organizations, including the Communist Party of Belarus, that support Lukashenko. There's probably right-wing nationalist organizations do this too as well. But that's also because he's guaranteeing something of the remnants of socialism for the population there. But we see, I think it was 2004 when they really started, the U.S. started really throwing money through the National Endowment for Democracy and USAID, which probably most of your viewers will know, are just CIA fronts.
Is Canada doing the same with CEDA or whatever, or whatever deep state actor Canada is doing the same as well in Belarus?
Yeah, Canada has involvement through foreign affairs and through support through NGOs, lots of NGOs and things like that, civil democracy organizations. But so we say imperialism is at it again. I think that's exactly it, because you see, if we weren't talking about Belarus, you can see these same sort of techniques placed in all the time, which is like, okay, make sure election observers don't show up. They did this to Venezuela, right? They did this in Bolivia. It was like, so they made up some fucking excuse that, I think, who was it? The OSCE was invited, and they said, oh, we weren't invited. And then it was revealed, yes, they were invited. Oh, well, it was too late, and we couldn't go. Oh, so they're creating a situation where there's a crisis, there's a lack of confidence in the decision, right? And so the opposition supporter got 10% and then says, oh, obviously it was going to win. And this is a bullshit election. This is ridiculous. If we don't get those numbers. It's Navalny does this in Russia too, right? Should we do this? Should we say, oh, look at, we didn't get any television coverage. We would have won the election. This is foul. The UN has to invade Canada. Put us no, this is ridiculous. But you can do it when you're backed up by imperialism, because and fundamentally, even if you have a different political project in mind, They're going to use you. Even if Guaido in Venezuela was, let's say, not an honest, let's say a left liberal or something who still wanted to maintain aspects of the Bolivarian Revolution but didn't like Maduro or something. The fact is that they don't give a shit about what this guy thinks. They're using him, so he can say whatever he wants. But at the end of the day, if they put him in, it's not going to be Guaido in power. Just like he doesn't have control of the billions that they stole from Citgo or the money sitting in the Bank of England. These people are tools, they're agents, and whether they know it or not. So this is exactly what we see in Belarus. Is just like the same that we've seen in places. They want the Bolivian model. That's what they want to happen right now. And if they can put in a caretaker government, they'll do that. If they can impose the opposition figure, they'll do that. But that's what we see is happening in Belarus. Yeah, it's similar to Ukraine.
Yeah, exactly. Now, the reason why I think the propaganda against Putin has worked so well, and why so many pseudo leftists and even sincere leftists supported the Western EU NATO backed coup in Ukraine, which just replaced a right nationalist with just a Western puppet, a rival oligarch. And of course, but of course, with Ukraine, just like with Putin, and even a lot of propaganda we see at China, with the Hong Kong protests, is half truths. We see half truths weaponized to the point where it becomes just full blown fake news propaganda against the imperialist targets. So, what are the half truths of Belarus that the powers to be are using to get the left to march to the imperial beats?
I'd say the biggest and most obvious is that Lukashenko doesn't have popular support. That it's somehow some rigged up system. Of course, I think there's going to be unsavory elements, just like there are unsavory elements to every government. But I think the reality is that he does have wide popular support, and that the popular support that the opposition has is a popular support that is a violation of national sovereignty. You're working with foreign powers that want to destroy and loot your country, whether you think you're doing some great push for democracy or not. Obviously, I think there's people who believe that what they're doing is going to have some different result than Ukraine, but that's not the case. So the half truths that are operating are that it's I saw you probably saw this on Twitter too. There was a women's march, and one of the Western correspondents was like, look at this crazy violation of their human rights. They're doing it. And what was it? It was like police kind of like holding back the women and like pushing them a bit. You compare this to, like, this is an example of horrific violent repression or something. Like I've seen way worse than that in Toronto. Never mind what's happening in the United States, where they're shooting you and like shooting people in the fucking streets. Pardon my language. So it's, I don't know. So those two half truths, that Lukashenko doesn't have popular support and that there's some sort of overwhelming violent state apparatus that's disappearing people in the middle of the nights and cutting their heads off or something. And it's like, no. I mean, there's a struggle there, but I also think that, and this is maybe people think it's unsavory, when your national sovereignty is at stake, you have the right to protect yourself, and sometimes that includes people who are operating as a fifth column for imperialism. I think this is the case with Hong Kong too. I mean, I guess I'm more familiar with Hong Kong. Canada's a little more involved with that. The support in Belarus is a little quieter, although our new foreign affairs minister, Champagne, is pledged all of his support to the opposition. But in Hong Kong, the reality is too. It gets weird about the left. What does Hong Kong? What do the opposition in Hong Kong want to save? They want to save an island of capitalism, basically, with fucking judges who wear British wigs, like Milton Friedman's fucking golden goose. This is what they're saying, and the left is going like, oh, of course it's billionaires. Look, this is the reality. When what's happening in sorry to interrupt, but the people in Hong Kong, what they're protesting for, and when I spell this out to people, they look at me very strangely, but they're against, China being able to extradite murderers that are fleeing. Yeah, it was a man who murdered his pregnant girlfriend. Like that's what sparked off this most recent round of protests, and that they wanted to extradite him to be like this. But this is the reality. What they're scared of is an extradition of billionaires in Hong Kong, of oligarch criminals to the mainland to face justice. That's really what's scared. That's why Jimmy Lai is pouring out as much money as he can in these organizations.
Jimmy Lai, who's described as the Hong Kong Rupert Murdoch. Yeah.
Yeah, runs Apple Daily, which is like a very xenophobic, right-wing, anti-mainland Chinese thing. I mean, what is happening in Hong Kong is decolonization. A colony that is made up of people who ran away from the revolution, of who pushed out and subjected the indigenous minorities who are on that fucking island, is now being returned to Chinese territory. And decolonization is ugly and awful and messy, as basically most of the global South, because it was being colonized and still is in some fashion, knows. It's not a nice process. People have interests in Hong Kong. They don't want to be incorporated into mainland China. Not, I'd say, a section of that class. I think there is a working class there. Working class is maybe a different thing because it's such a finance place. There are young finance students basically who are seeing that there's not really a future either for Hong Kong as a place where international capital comes before it gets invested in China, because China can do that by themselves. Why would you hire somebody who doesn't speak Mandarin to deal with a mainland like Chinese factory? So finance capital is changing in Hong Kong. So that means that there's people there who pay an incredible amount of money for these little shoebox apartments. Many of them also, rely on migrant labor that they abuse the hell out of, these housekeepers. Let's say there may be a petite bourgeois or like lower middle class group of people who are very anxious. So that's the youth who are out there supporting it. They're ones who went into finance because they thought, like generations before them, they could be bankers who were just managing international capital. But China is now like, fuck that. Like like Shenzhen is next door. Look at this place. Like, look at what's happening in Hong Kong. And so it's an unfortunate system, but I think what's happening there is a fascist response to decolonization, which is why they adopt international fascist symbols like Pepe, or they have signs that say Donald Trump dressed as Rambo, save us. Like, if you spend any amount of time looking at the actual structure of this thing, yeah, well, you know what? Fascism has mass movements too, right? It's animated by people's real economic anxieties. We know that, leftist demagogic, like the demagogic use of leftist language, the Nazis did it. Benito Mussolini, a former socialist, did it. This is what they do. They take actual existing economic anxiety and they direct it where capital wants it to be directed, which is racist attacks on mainland Chinese, describing them as cockroaches, setting a fucking man on fire. This is what fascists do. So when I look at that, and they're wearing black shirts. Frankly, I think it's a fascist response to decolonization. That's my view of Hong Kong.
No, and not only that, some of those ultra Ukrainian nationalists, and dare I say, let's call them by their name, those Ukrainian neo-Nazis that overthrew the previous government, that wanted to have much more of a non-aligned movement between the EU and Russia and not be part of NATO. Some of those thugs have actually gone to Hong Kong as a form of solidarity protest against Hong Kong's resistance towards the Chinese.
I'll tell a story. Last summer, I guess last August, when the protests were happening, there was some Chinese students who had contacted us at the party because in a neighboring city, they had shut down the Chinese Canadian Scholars Association, which was students and academics, because they said it was a tool of the Chinese state, basically because it had mainland Chinese students who were in it. It had international students. The administration at this school said that the person who pushed the administration to get it shut down said that, actually this was worse than another organization, a scholastic organization that had shut down, the Dominion Group, which was like actual neo-Nazis. It was worse because they were funded by China, because China was behind this. So these kids contacted us very upset about it, very upset about what they were seeing presented in the Canadian state media and the news about, the demonization of China. So I got together with them. They said, look, we want to go. There's this pro Hong Kong protest. We want to go and check it out and you know and be there and register our support for our country against what's going on there. So I said, okay, yeah, we'll go down to do it. Anyways, we go there, and the group of people who are there supporting this Hong Kong protest is like I don't know, it's like the old anti-Comintern like fascist like organization. There's you know people with the South Vietnamese flag. I'm recognizing like right-wing fascists, like white supremacists I've seen from other rallies and stuff like that. Like it's, you know, Falun Gong, the racist cult is there. It's just it's a conglomeration of right-wing actors, international right-wing actors, and fascist or ultra-right organizations. And they know what they want. They hate communism, and they want to keep Hong Kong as a capitalist entity, and they want to support the people there. So and people from the.
Yeah. So one final thing then about the Hong Kong protests then. So is it safe to say because people are going to respond to this saying you guys are being apologists for Chinese tyranny, but really, again, it's not a simple these are the good guys, these are the bad guys. It's more like, hey guys, it's more about guys, this is imperialism versus sovereignty of another person's country. And so and then these people protesting in Hong Kong, they don't want some liberal democracy, let alone even a social democracy. These are actually very reactionary forces who don't even want to be part of a Chinese model, which even allows capitalism but puts a little bit of a lid on them, right?
Yeah. No, they want to maintain what they have, which is control of Hong Kong as a capitalist entity. I mean, we see even in the legislature there's a minority, let's say, mainland supporting group. Because this is the other thing too, is like there is not a majority separatist movement in Hong Kong. The majority of the population there does not want to separate. This is why they're pushing these violent tactics in order to provoke a response from the People's Republic of China. And if you look at the response, it was just minimal stuff. There was I think there's been one death, and there's a guy who fell off a building. Like the Chinese response to incredible violence. If that happened in Toronto, no, people would be shot. There would be hell to pay, basically. I think so. Back to the legislature, though. So a lot of the issues, the mainland Chinese forces, which include socialists, communists, and some sections of the business community, want the issues of Hong Kong to be dealt with. One of the big things is housing. There's this big land preserve that developers have, the state has holding over that can be used to build housing. They try to do it all the time, but the developers and owners who own that land want to speculate because that land is so valuable. They don't want to build social housing. Nobody in a capitalist society wants to build social housing. That's ridiculous. You can't make a profit from it. So they're the ones also spurring on these economic anxieties that then they're able to manipulate and use against China, basically. So yeah, that's.
And then one last thing about Belarus. Now, I actually had Dr. Maria Chernat, and we talked about Romania under Ceausescu. So if anyone thinks I'm an apologist for human rights abuse of communist countries, I'm not. I do call them out. But we talked about how Romania, which is a perfect example for all of Eastern Europe, has just been living in a capitalist hellhole since then. The reactionary shock doctrine. If Lukashenko is overthrown in Belarus, will we see? Do you think we are definitely going to see yet another Eastern European country experience the capitalism's hellhole?
Yeah. Ceausescu is an interesting example because in the 80s he actually took IMF loans, which led to a lot of the problems. It was not necessarily the socialist model that it was imperfect, but wasn't necessarily socialism so much as borrowing from the IMF that led to a lot of problems. But yeah, this is exactly what they've done. I think it's the anniversary now of the annexation of East Germany this weekend, and I look at Germany right now. This is a wealthy country. When they went in there, they got rid of the unions. They privatized everything. they shipped factories over to the West. East Germany, or what remains of East Germany right now, is full of like ultra right-wing nationalist movements, industrial underdevelopment in one of the most advanced and richest countries on this planet, and is
who are the top dogs of the EU? The EU is a lot of times German businesses in Germany dictating to everyone how to run their economy.
Yeah, exactly. And you look at population decline, people moving and stuff in all the Eastern European former socialist bloc countries. They were looted and they were colonized in a sense. Why are there Polish builders in England? They're used as like a migrant labor force for Western European capital, and they loot everything else. They did this to Yugoslavia too. Broke it up, balkanized it. Like this is appropriately enough. This is the model, and I think anybody with any sense, any real historical sense, should know that. Even if they hope against hope that this is not going to be the thing that happens. These aren't real popular uprisings. They're built upon real anxieties. I agree with that. There's people who are very honest and are participating in this with honest and good intentions, and I don't mean to slander them. But I think if you look at how this is played out everywhere, we know how it ends. I mean, sometimes, probably you get this too. People accuse people of knee-jerk anti-Americanism. Well, if you just take the opposite line of the Americans all the time. So I got pretty annoyed with this. So sometimes, usually when I'm accused of it about something, I say, okay, how about this? Why don't we bet $100 in 5 years we're going to figure out that I'm right? And I'll put it in my Google Calendar, and we'll do this. I did this with Syriza with somebody, and I won a nice T-shirt. I said they were really hopeful. Syriza's going to do this. I say, in a year, let's make a bet. Let's figure this out. And of course, Syriza capitulated. So, look, knee-jerk anti-Americanism, if you were a betting man, it's a pretty good bet. But obviously, if you want to look into the issues too, historically, it's backed up by this experience. And it's a model that they use, and they use it because it's so effective. And unfortunately, it's also effective in capturing a lot of the left who want to, I think, honestly support.
That's also because the half-truths, and half-truths are the most difficult form of propaganda to combat because yes, Putin is an autocratic guy. Yes, the Chinese, that's not a system I want to live under. And yes, Lukashenko probably, is not, in terms of human rights, I'll go for Maduro and Chavez over him any day. But that being said, that does not mean that we should support. I mean, and I mean, in the end of the day, come on, guys. You really trust America, Britain, the European Union, and Canada to be supporting the good guys this time around when their entire history is based on always supporting reactionary politics?
I was like, oh no, Macron knows what's best for Lebanon. Macron's going to help him out, just like he helped out Libya, or just like rather the French helped out Libya. It gets very distressing, I guess. But I think this goes into the collapse of what used to be considered just a general leftist ideal, not even a leftist ideal, just an international relations ideal, which is the sovereignty of nations, national sovereignty. This was the big thing that came out of the United Nations in the post-war period, put in there because of the Soviet Union and the non-aligned movement, who understood that we're going through a period of decolonization, that people fundamentally should determine their own path. And that means not having imperialism decide that, oh, this is the opposition figure we want. Here's a bunch of money, destabilize it. No, now we say that your elections don't count according to us. Like that used to be a left liberal idea that like someone like Thomas Frank or someone even further to the right, that it's just a good thing for people to have national sovereignty, that is fundamentally the basis of any sort of democracy that a people can have. That idea, unfortunately, is being replaced by this liberal imperialist R2P doctrine that is coming from NATO, coming from an imperialist bloc, and trying to infiltrate into the United Nations at the bequest of imperialist powers. I think any honest socialist has to take a principled stand, which is that national sovereignty, even for countries that you don't like, that I don't like, if that it's a principle that we should uphold still, because that's national sovereignty is the basis. What was it at Nuremberg? They said the fundamental crime of the Nazis, the crime from which all other crimes stemmed, was the war of aggression, was interfering in another country and trying to destroy it for the control of yourself. So what we have with NATO, which is made up of fuck, I mean, they just moved the Nazis into NATO after World War II. What we have is this sort of like fascist ideal, which is the control of other nations, put into a liberal imperialist trap. And I mean, in Canada, we have the former Foreign Affairs Minister Chrystia Freeland, the granddaughter, an unapologetic admirer of her Nazi grandfather, which she claimed was Russian disinformation, which is not, is bringing in like a hard-edged sort of neoconservative NATO liberal imperialist idea into a foreign policy that traditionally, even under the Liberals, was a little more circumspect about how they served imperialism or how they went around imperialism. And this is incredibly dangerous. We see in Canada, especially, we're actively engaged in more things that we would be circumspect about before. Like, you know, we handed over Patrice Lumumba in the Congo to be murdered, but we were kind of quiet about it. It was the peacekeepers who did it. It's okay. You know, this is a peacekeeping thing too. But now we're working with the Lima Group to actively try to overthrow the Venezuelan government. Belarus too, as well. Support for Hong Kong, going along with the like anti-China campaigns, stuff like that.
And supporting the Christian fascist oligarchs of Bolivia.
Yeah, very much. And we've been tracking this a bit. There's after Morales was ousted by the Christo-fascists, Canadian mining companies started signing all of these deals, gold mining and obviously lithium and things like that. But yeah, so I don't know. It's a very dangerous time in the world right now. The other thing too is just a consideration going along with this is the one thing the left doesn't have power in most Western countries or even anything close to it. And the unfortunate thing that we do have the power to go along with is to give left cover for imperialist ambitions, and accepting these half-truths as fact and wanting to be like, I'm principled, I support anybody undergoing human rights abuses everywhere, blah, blah, blah. Look, the only thing you're doing is helping the ruling class get what it wants. That's the only thing we can do. So I think it's very important to be able to say, you know, and if we get it wrong, who cares? I'm not in the fucking government. Like, I don't know, you know, the only thing I can do is stop some harm from being done. If I make the wrong call in Xinjiang in China or something like that, whatever, it's happening there anyways. But I can stop at least, or try to be some sort of a voice to say, look, we don't want to go into this sort of head-on conflict with a nuclear power that will defend itself. I don't want nuclear war. So let's go back to trying to assert national sovereignty as the basis for any sort of popular self-rule.
My last two questions is what's the Communist Party of Canada's position on Quebec if Quebec ever was to have like another referendum on independence? Would the Communist Party of Canada prefer that Quebec remain part of Canada, or okay, if you want a divorce, okay, do it democratically and have at it?
Well, we unequivocally support the right of Quebec to separate, and as well as Indigenous nations. I mean, this is sort of like a Leninist principle from the beginning, which is the support for self-determination. So we support the right to self-determination, that if they so choose, they can do it. And of course, there's going to be a lot of issues if they do, especially with Indigenous nations, things like that. That's for them to work out. But do we think it's a good idea? No, we don't think that breaking up Canada per se would be good, because it's, you know, I mean, this is what capital is pushing in Alberta. There's a Wexit party right now, and a certain section of capital is very interested in Alberta splitting off so it can join the United States. And we think that one of the things that might happen too in Quebec is that U.S. capital will then use it to help bolster their ability there. So fundamentally what we want is a united working class and oppressed peoples in this country to work together. Will Canada come out of that looking like, you know, having the same borders or something like that if we're moving towards socialism? Probably not. There'll probably be different things. There'll be, you know, the experience of socialist countries in the past has been of autonomous regions, or even, you know, Arab republics and stuff like that have had it. It'll be different, but we think that the only thing that the working class and oppressed peoples have is unity. That's all we have. We don't have weapons. We don't have the money. We don't have, you know, we have the power to stop working, and we have to do it together. So That was one of the reasons we were part of Quebec Solidaire. Oh,
yeah.
Sorry. We were part of Quebec Solidaire. We're one of the founding members of Quebec Solidaire, which is a left organization, not a socialist, a left party, not a socialist party, but a left party that contains other collectives who are socialists and some non. We left them about, or the Parti Communiste de Quebec left them about 2 years ago, I think, when they merged with another party, Option Nationale, and we left them because they, at that point, said the first thing we're going to concentrate on is sovereignty. And they didn't really talk to the membership about that. We think that was to the detriment of the left work that they were doing. But do we oppose their right to secede? No. And we think that the Clarity Act, which is basically a way for the government of Canada to mess around and stop Quebec, is very we think it's very anti-democratic. We don't agree with that whatsoever. Yeah. So yeah, we support the right to divorce, but we don't necessarily want the divorce, let's say.
That's sort of is a good way to apply also to the whole issue of Spain with Catalonia and the Basques. Mm-hmm. I personally am against both Basques and the Catalans seceding because I don't because I find that it's just reactionary nationalism and I think in Catalonia again a lot of those people are just reverse racists who just want to have their own. Their own thing if Catalonia becomes its own country. But yeah, if they really do want to have a referendum, then it just needs to be like with Scotland and Quebec. It needs to be democratic. It needs to be very clear, and that's that. But we're going to save that conversation for another day. Last question I wanted to ask you then is this one because you mentioned Indigenous rights, and I really like that that you talked a lot about the rights of Indigenous people. So, if the Communist Party of Canada had a super majority federal or held most of a majority provincial government, how would you guys dismantle the apartheid First Nations, Inuits, and Mao-Tse live under, and bring justice to these people and address their grievances?
So, I mean, we imagine that we don't want to be too prescriptive because we think that anything like this will be different depending on the Indigenous nations, depending on what they want. But fundamentally, we think this is an issue that's never been settled. No Indigenous nations signed on to the Constitution. Quebec didn't even sign on to the Constitution. This is another feature of anti-democratic Canada. We have a Constitution that is not really fully ratified, and yet it sort of guides our governance. This is people say Canada is a fake country sometimes for things like this. It was started as a monopoly corporation. The Hudson's Bay Corporation existed before Canada, so I mean we've always been kind of a sham of a democracy, even in any sense of a popular democracy. But one of the first things we envision too is that we would like to replace the Senate, the unelected Senate I was mentioning before, with a House of Nationalities, basically that would have representatives from all the Indigenous nations and that would have the force of law. Venezuela has something like that with the Constituent Assembly. It has certain seats laid out for Indigenous people, and their other assembly does as well. And so what that would look like is we would use it as a Constituent Assembly to create an actual democratic constitution that would give Indigenous nations rights to their resources, that would give them land back, that would give them the rights that they fundamentally have. The immediate thing too as well would be Justin Trudeau said he was going to do this. The BC NDP said they were going to do this, was to honor UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. The key feature of that, which no capitalist government will ever agree to, frankly, is to give Indigenous nations the right to have a say on any sort of resource extractive, or any sort of industrial projects on their land. No government in Canada has done that or ever will under capitalism, I don't think, or unless there's a transitionary stage. So we think that's very important, and that's something that we fight for. And that would lead to them saying, just like the Wet'suwet'en, they would say, we don't want this. We don't want these pipelines. We don't want this development. We don't want this gold mine with cyanide everywhere on our land. And currently in Canada, what we have is under Section 13C of the Constitution, something called duty to consult, which is not a veto. It's not consensual. It's basically you have to say, well, we're going to build this, whether you like it or not, but we're going to ask you how you feel about it before we do it. I mean, this is not like,
Which,
I don't know.
which is how all of the parties always talk about First Nations people. The conservatives, the liberals, even the NDP. They all say, yes, we respect Indigenous rights. Yes, we know that they don't like this pipeline because it destroys their sacred territories. It's going to pollute their water. But we're at least going to ask them first before we just bulldoze them.
Yeah,
Insane.
But this is, I mean, this is the thing. The theft of Indigenous resources is foundational to Canadian capital, and it's still ongoing. I think one of the things that we'll see, because I think Canada is trying to be more of an imperialist power right now, that is going to lead to problems too. But along with that and the crisis of capitalism, what it means is there's going to be an inward sort of an inward hastening of colonialism, and that's why there's a sort of rush to settle Indigenous land claims in order to extinguish title, which is to say, okay, here's some land, here's some money, but after that, it's gone. You don't have any more Indigenous claims to the land, because they know that in a crisis of capitalism, you've got to say, okay, we need pipelines. Okay, we need more mines. Okay, we need the things that we build outside of Canada that we try to do and impose on other people. We do that right here on Indigenous nations. So there's a different dynamic, I guess, in the Americas than maybe other sort of capitalist formations. But yeah, so that's why a social democratic government, a liberal government, a conservative government, at the end of the day, they all treat Indigenous people the same because they're servants of capital.
It's a caste, yeah. It's a caste system in which the Indigenous people are the Dalits and are the untouchables.
Yeah, and there's two different tactics of extermination. Some of it's outright extermination, which the ruling class has kind of lost its appetite for, and the other one is assimilation, which is a project of destroying their cultures, destroying the ability to live where they want to, destroying collective property ownership. We think that's one of the interesting features of Indigenous nationhood that makes, can be syncretic with Marxism-Leninism, which is a commitment to collective property, which fundamentally we have. So we think that undoing the colonial state in Canada is a project that we deeply believe in, and that we also believe is a way to help build socialism. And socialism here, because of the characteristics of the experience of colonialism, because Canada's a developed capitalist country, will have different features than other things. So frankly, I think it's interesting, and it'll be intriguing to see. Hopefully I'll get to see it in my lifetime. I don't know about that, but that's the aim anyways.
Yeah, the great John Pilger, the journalist that influenced me the most to even want to do stuff like this, and he covers a lot the plight of Aboriginal people, which he's championed many times. He once said, one of the best quotes in one of the many documentaries he did about Aboriginal affairs was that nothing is going to change until we right the wrongs of the bloody past, and until we give them back their nationhood, we can never claim. No, until we give them back their nationhood, we can never claim our own.
That's exactly, yeah. I agree 100%. I'm a big admirer of John Pilger.
He's brilliant.
Yeah, Utopia was maybe the most recent one about.
Yeah, Utopia. I think that was either his 7th or 8th documentary, not just on Australia, but about Aboriginal affairs. And when I saw all of his documentaries about Australia, that made me want to confront more the plight of Indigenous people around the world, because the plight of Indigenous people is completely bottom priority of the respectable left. It's very popular to get behind Palestinian rights, very popular to get behind the plight of Black Americans, and I say fantastic. I'm happy about that. But when it comes to Indigenous people, even when you talk to people about the plight of Indigenous people, they're like, oh yeah, Indigenous people, we should actually be. But there you go.
Yeah, no, I mean it's because it's the attempt to exterminate them, and part of the extermination is to write them out of existing now, as to say like there's some sort of historical artifacts or something. It's really pernicious. But fundamentally, I don't think in whether it's in the United States or it's in Canada. And Gerald Horne, I don't know, you probably know him. He wrote a great book called The Apocalypse of Settler Colonialism, and he says basically, there's no path to socialism unless we deal with this. We deal with the legacy of slavery in Canada, chattel slavery too, and the legacy of colonialism, and not just the legacy, but the existing fact of colonialism.
The ongoing project.
Yeah, the ongoing project of it. Yeah.
And but I'm much more optimistic about the rights of Indigenous people. Hopefully, hopefully being achieved unless climate change or nuclear war completely wipes us out. But I'm much more optimistic about Indigenous people, sort of, breaking apart from the caste system that they're in, because I'm seeing the Black Lives Matter movement in Canada merge with the Indigenous Lives Matter movement, and both of them merging together, amongst comrades, and really, saying, Canada, your days of white supremacy, your days of colonialism are numbered, and I hope that happens in the U.S. soon. And it's great that that the rights of Maori people are talked about a lot in New Zealand, where there's even the Maori middle class. And Australia, I mean, even though still a long ways to go, but the civil rights movement there is still very robust, but still has a long way to go.
Yeah, I know that is one of the more interesting developments, is the merging of sort of the Indigenous struggle with Black Lives Matter and a recognition of the structural systemic racism of capitalism in Canada. It's really heartening to see that it's sometimes it's not the best or whatever, the most theorized, but that it seeps into just a general liberal sort of consciousness in Canada, not just the social democratic left, but just general liberals are sort of getting more conscious of it. So that's, it's not all misery up here. I guess there's some good things going on.
A little bit of hope. Just have a little bit of hope. So
yeah, and hopefully labor can get its act together and start bringing these struggles together, because that's really the only way. Unfortunately, social movements can come and go too. We need to connect them all together, and hopefully for a liberatory, emancipatory project, which is building socialism.
And hopefully in Canada, they do embrace more the Communist Party, as opposed to being, you guys be around, that core. But alrighty. On that note, I think that's a perfect place to conclude. So, ladies and gentlemen, we were joined on this fantastic episode of 1+1 with Jay Watts, organizer of the Communist Party of Canada. Jay, I learned so much from you, so we definitely have to have you back, because there's so much about because I still have so much about Canadian history, past and present, that I need to learn about. So I definitely want to have you. So yeah, we're definitely going to have to have you back.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, I enjoyed it quite a bit, and you know quite a bit, so I don't know how much more you need to learn. But yeah, you're very informed. It's a pleasure to talk to you. And again, my apologies for having to know about Canadian politics.
No. The audience loves it. The audience loves it, and one of my Canadian fans who actually has a novel, Susan Orion, was saying that she loves, when I do these all Canada editions, especially since she is a Canadian who doesn't get this kind of truth-telling and myth-busting. Yeah, you're not going to get it from the CBC or Global News. So, ladies and gentlemen, we were joined by Jay Watts. We're definitely going to have him back as a regular. Jay, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.